Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty crucial. Uh, the psychology of money, how we think about money.
Mm.
You mentioned Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money, and specifically, you're interested in going a bit deeper than just the numbers, the mechanics of finance.
Mm-hmm.
You really want to understand the human side of it all, right?
Mm-hmm.
So today we're going to try to pull out some of that core wisdom from Housel's book and zero in on how your feelings and behaviors really end up shaping your financial life.
Yeah, and this whole deep dive is kind of inspired by a conversation between Ryan and Emily. They actually went through House's book chapter by chapter, and they had some really interesting real-world examples that they brought to the table.
Oh, cool.
So we'll definitely be using some of those today
Yeah.
to really illustrate those key insights.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that practical lens.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, at the heart of it all, right, one of the central ideas that Housel puts forward in the book, and is a big one for you, the learner, is that doing well with money has very little to do with how smart you are and a lot to do with how you behave. And I think that's so interesting because it really reframes the whole conversation around success with money. It's not necessarily about knowing all the complex formulas and strategies. It's about understanding our own, internal psychology.
Exactly. And let's just jump right into it then with chapter 1. No one's crazy.
Okay.
So the big takeaway here is that everyone's financial actions, even the ones that seem totally irrational from the outside, actually make perfect sense when you consider their own personal experiences and background.
Okay, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's give an example. Like, imagine someone who lived through the Great Depression.
Right.
Maybe that fear of losing everything is just so ingrained that they're incredibly risk averse.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they're even, hoarding cash, literally like stuffing it under a mattress,
Yeah.
despite what financial experts might say about long-term growth in the stock market or whatever.
Right.
Right. It's not that they don't understand. It's that their financial decisions are really coming from a very deep personal place.
Yeah. And it's a totally, like you said, legitimate response to a major life event.
Right.
And on the flip side, you could have someone who's only ever experienced good economic times.
Yeah, booming markets.
Yeah. They might be super aggressive in their investments because to them, that just seems like the only logical path.
Right, like they've never seen anything else.
Exactly. It's not that one person's right and the other's wrong. It's more that they have these contrasting realities that have really shaped their financial views.
It's true.
Even just
Right.
think about like different generations and how they view things like debt or home ownership. I mean, a lot of that comes down to the economic landscapes they grew up in.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something important for you, the learner, to think about too. It's like, recognizing that these financial decisions aren't always like these purely rational calculations.
Right.
They're often coming from these really deeply personal backgrounds and viewpoints.
Mm.
So, I think it encourages us to be a little bit more understanding of other people's choices.
Absolutely.
And even maybe our own, like, seemingly irrational quirks around money.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to chapter 2, luck and risk.
Okay.
This is where Housel says that these two forces, luck and risk, are inseparable. They're like two sides of the same coin, and they actually play a much bigger role in our financial outcomes than we often give them credit for.
Yeah.
And he uses this really powerful example of Bill Gates and his friend Kent Evans.
Mm-hmm.
So both of these guys were, incredibly intelligent and driven, but their lives went in completely different directions.
Mm-hmm.
Gates obviously achieved this massive success.
Yeah.
But Evans tragically died at a young age. And, it kind of throws a wrench into that whole idea that success is only about merit or intelligence or hard work, because there's this huge element of just unpredictable events,
Right. And that's what's so fascinating about this chapter. We often look at someone like Bill Gates and try to reverse engineer their success. We're like, oh, it's because he was so brilliant or worked so hard. But we completely forget about the role of just being in the right place at the right time, or even the absence of really negative events that could have happened. Right.
So I think the caution here is, don't blindly copy what someone else has done, because there's probably a big element of luck involved.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And also, to be a little bit more, I guess, gracious or understanding of people who haven't achieved that level of success, because, there could be all sorts of circumstances, all sorts of events that were completely outside of their control.
Right.
So I think it's a very humbling perspective on achievement.
Okay, so moving on to chapter 3, never enough.
Okay.
This chapter delves into, I think, a really critical aspect of financial psychology, which is the danger of always wanting more and how important it is to really define what enough means to you.
Yeah. This is a big one for me. The story of Rajat Gupta. I mean, here's this incredibly successful businessman, right?
Yeah. Seems like he had it all.
Yeah, and he still ends up in prison for insider trading.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, like, what is driving that behavior? Is it just about the money, or is there something deeper going on there? Right. And I think that's the real question. What is that insatiable desire rooted in? A lot of times, it's social comparison.
Keeping up with the Joneses.
Right, or feeling like you're not measuring up to some external benchmark. But as Gupta's story shows, that kind of pursuit can be really destructive, even for people who seem to be at the top of their game.
Absolutely. So for you, the learner, the takeaway here is really about, establishing your own definition of financial success and contentment.
Right.
And I think that's not a luxury that's essential.
Right.
Because without that, you risk just constantly striving for more and potentially jeopardizing everything you've already built and your own well-being. It's like, what are some of those personal values that might help define that sense of enough for you?
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit to Chapter 4, Confounding Compounding.
Okay.
This is where Housel really highlights the power of compound interest.
Right.
How it often works, kind of quietly in the background, but the cumulative effects over the long term are just incredible.
Yeah. This is the magic of time at work, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
He points out that Warren Buffett actually accumulated more than 95% of his wealth after he turned 65.
Wow.
Which is pretty crazy when you think about it. It really just highlights that power of staying invested and letting time do its thing.
Right. It's not about getting rich quick. It's about that long game.
Right.
It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. At first, it seems small and insignificant, but as it keeps rolling, it gathers more and more snow, and it gets bigger and bigger.
I love that.
And the key is time and consistency. Even small, regular contributions, when they have decades to compound, can grow into something really substantial.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about that? Like how your savings today could look in 20 or 30 years?
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
It really is. Okay, so moving on to Chapter 5, Getting Wealthy versus Staying Wealthy.
Okay.
So this one brings up a really insightful distinction that the skills and mindset you need to build wealth are actually different from the ones you need to preserve it over time.
That makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, getting wealthy often involves being optimistic, taking risks, and having that boldness to jump on opportunities.
Right.
But staying wealthy requires something else. You need humility to acknowledge that luck probably played a role. You need to be frugal to avoid unnecessary losses. And you even need a healthy dose of fear, fear of losing what you've worked so hard to build.
So what are some things that Housel suggests we can do to actually focus on staying wealthy? What are some of those concrete actions?
Well, consistent saving is still super important regardless of how much you're earning.
Makes sense.
Avoiding big risks that you don't fully understand is another crucial one. And then building and maintaining a financial safety net, for those unexpected curveballs that life throws at you.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about prioritizing long-term security and resilience over those quick gains. It's kind of like the difference between sprinting and running a marathon.
Yeah.
The strategies for success are very different.
Yeah, I love that analogy.
Okay. Chapter 6, Tails, you win. So here, Housel introduces this idea that many of the most significant successes, not just financially, but in life, are often driven by just a handful of exceptional positive outcomes.
He calls them tail events.
Exactly.
Okay.
So think about venture capitalists, for example.
Mm-hmm.
A big chunk of their investments might fail.
Yeah.
But those few that become mega hits, like investing early in a company that becomes the next Google or Amazon, those can produce returns that make up for all the losses.
Right. The whole success of the fund hinges on those few outliers.
Exactly. And Housel argues that this principle applies beyond just investing.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so how so?
Well, think about your career. Maybe making one key decision to take a certain job or learn a certain skill that could have this huge positive ripple effect on your entire career path.
Yeah.
Or even in your personal life. Choosing the right partner can be like a massive tail event in terms of your happiness and fulfillment.
That's true.
It's kind of like you don't need every decision to be a home run. You just need a few really big wins over the course of your life.
I like that.
Okay, moving on to Chapter 7, Freedom.
Okay.
This chapter gets to the heart of what a lot of people truly value about wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really about the number in your bank account. It's about what that number allows you to do and to be.
Okay.
So Housel's argument is that the true value of wealth lies in the freedom. It gives you, the freedom to control your time, to make choices that are aligned with your values, and to pursue things that you're truly passionate about.
I love that. It's less about buying fancy things and more about gaining independence and options.
Exactly. What does financial freedom look like for you?
Yeah.
I mean, think about it.
Yeah, and saving money then becomes this incredibly powerful tool to actually achieve that freedom, right? It's not just about amassing a huge fortune. It's about buying yourself time and the ability to deal with life's uncertainties on your own terms.
Right? That financial cushion gives you a buffer if you lose your job or if you have a medical emergency.
Yeah.
You know, it gives you space to make decisions thoughtfully instead of being forced into something you don't want to do just because you're desperate for money.
Yeah, that's real freedom.
It is.
All right. Chapter 8 introduces this really interesting concept called the man in the car paradox.
Ah, yes.
I love this one because it really got me thinking about how we view wealth and success.
Yeah.
So, we see someone driving this fancy, expensive car,
Mm-hmm.
and we automatically think, wow, they must be so successful and important. But are we really admiring the person, or are we admiring something else?
Yeah, and that's what's so insightful here. You know, our admiration is often directed at the car itself, that symbol of wealth,
Yeah.
not the person driving it. We don't actually know anything about their character or their intelligence or if they're actually successful. We're just kind of mistaking the signal for the reality.
Yeah, and that desire to show off your wealth through possessions is often driven by wanting status and recognition from others. But as Housel points out, that kind of admiration is pretty superficial and fleeting.
Yeah.
It's directed at the object, not the individual.
It's a performance.
Yeah, it really is.
But, true respect and admiration, those are earned through your character and actions and what you contribute to the world, not through just showing off how much money you have.
Right. There's something really admirable about someone who has that financial security but doesn't feel the need to flaunt it. It's like this quiet confidence.
Absolutely.
Okay, Chapter 9, Wealth is What You Don't See.
All right.
This one offers a really different way of thinking about wealth. It challenges that idea that being wealthy means having all these visible signs of affluence.
Right. And Housel makes this brilliant point that true wealth is often invisible. It's the money you haven't spent.
Mm-hmm.
It's the savings and investments that are kind of hidden away. We tend to focus on what we can see, expensive cars, vacations, big houses.
Right, the stuff that's on Instagram.
Exactly. But those things don't really tell us much about someone's actual financial health.
Right. He makes this really important distinction between being rich, which is having a high income, and being wealthy, which is having a lot of assets and low liabilities.
Right. A lot of people who look rich on the surface are actually drowning in debt. They're living paycheck to paycheck, even though they make a lot of money.
And that brings us to one of my favorite quotes from the book. He says, "Spending money to show people how much money you have is the fastest way to have less money."
Oh, yeah. That's a good one.
It's so true.
Yeah, it really emphasizes that it's more important to build that underlying foundation of financial security, even though it's often not visible, than it is to chase those fleeting appearances of wealth.
Right. It's about the long game, not the short-term show.
Exactly.
Okay, and finally, Chapter 10 kind of boils it all down to this really fundamental principle: save money.
Right, back to basics.
Yeah, and it might seem super obvious, but Housel stresses how critical it is, not just for reaching your financial goals, but as like a core philosophy for long-term security and creating opportunities in the future.
And he uses this great analogy. He compares saving to oxygen.
Okay.
You might not think about it all the time, but if it's not there, it can have some pretty serious, even life-altering consequences.
Yeah, that's a good one, especially when those unexpected events pop up.
Exactly. That financial buffer gives you resilience in a world that's full of uncertainty.
Absolutely. The unpredictable nature of life really makes having that cushion so important. It gives you that sense of security, allows you to handle things like job loss or medical emergencies without freaking out, and ultimately just gives you more control over your own life.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the psychology of money, I think we've seen that financial well-being is about so much more than understanding investments or chasing high returns. It's really about understanding your own behavior, cultivating patience, and aligning your financial choices with what you truly value in life.
Yeah, it's not about finding some magic formula. It's about developing this healthy and informed mindset around money. And by understanding these key psychological principles, the learner can approach your financial journey with more self-awareness and make decisions that support your long-term well-being and freedom. instead of, getting swept up in short-term impulses or feeling pressured to keep up with everyone else.
Right. And consider this, you know what? If you picked just one of these insights we talked about today and really focused on it, maybe today you sit down and define what enough means for you. Or maybe you make a conscious effort to prioritize building that invisible wealth instead of getting caught up in showing off. How might that shift your perspective on your own financial path starting right now?
Yeah. What new questions does that raise for you about your relationship with money and what you want your future to look like?
It's something to think about.
Absolutely. All right. That's it for our deep dive today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
I always learn so much from these conversations.
It was fun.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Bye.